Hi guys, I shall now be discussing image-based questions from the endocrinology domain. Let's get started with the very first one. He's talking about a 45-year-old lady with difficulty in climbing stairs. The moment you read difficulty in climbing stairs, we're talking about proximal myopathy in this patient. The hip joint muscles are involved. There's significant weight gain and a few cosmetic problems that are highlighted here. And in fact, you can definitely look from this image that is talking about one centripetal obesity and then presence of striae. You are familiar that in pregnancy the striae are gonna be pink in color, but in this case the striae are gonna be rather violet or even purplish in discoloration. In fact, he's also tried to show in the image presence of bleeds. Patients of Cushing syndrome tend to have a increased tendency for bleeding. They have a very thin and a fragile skin. Incidence of fungal infections is also more, and bleeds are also more common. He has himself mentioned that the midnight plasma cortisol value is grossly elevated in this case. You are familiar that in you and me, there's a diurnal variation of cortisol production and the values tend to dip at night. The values again will start rising from 6 a.m. in the morning when we're getting ready for work, going to our hospital, etc. That is when the stress comes in, so the stress hormone tends to increase. But bang in the middle of the night when we are sleeping, when we are relaxed, our cortisol values will be having rather a declining trend. So in a normal person, cortisol tends to decline in the night and then starts increasing from the morning routine of this person. But if in midnight you are going to draw a blood sample of a person and the values are consistently elevated, it definitely increases the diagnosis of Cushing syndrome. I have diagnosed Cushing syndrome in this MCQ from two perspectives. One is the image and second is the information provided. He's asking you accept scenario. Option number A says hyperpigmentation in ectopic ACTH production. Remember that ACTH has a partial MSH-like activity, so therefore hyperpigmentation is definitely noticed not only in Addison disease but even possible in Cushing syndrome because the ectopic ACTH will behave like MSH, so hyperpigmentation is okay. Purplish striae is what I said right at the outset. Hyperkalemia and metabolic alkalosis has to be sorted, though I think by this time you would have come to the right answer, but let me just give you the logic behind it. See, Cushing syndrome has hypercortisolism. Cortisol is a very smart hormone. It will not only activate the cortisol receptor, but it will even activate the epithelial sodium channel. The moment you activate the epithelial sodium channel, what's going to happen in this person is that it's going to contribute to more salt and water coming back in the system. And when more salt and more water will come back in the system, there will also be a corresponding urinary loss of potassium and hydrogen. And that is what I'm trying to highlight, that if there is going to be hypercortisolism, there is always going to be a hypokalemia along with metabolic alkalosis. From the current options that are given in this question, the answer to this question is option number C. Hyperkalemia would not be encountered here. It will actually be a hypokalemia. So this question was a relatively easy one and was testing out your basic knowledge of Cushing syndrome. Moving ahead, he is talking about a 25-year-old man with spade-like hands and the following physical appearance is best diagnosed with. So he's basically trying to highlight regarding two things. One is the prominent jawline of this patient. Well, I've shown a WWE wrestler, our dear Khali, and due to pituitary adenoma, he is talking about acromegaly contributing to prognathism as well as spade-like hands. You see the size of the hands will increase, finger thickness will increase, foot size will increase in the individual. In acromegaly, the height obviously remains the same, but it is the peripheral parts of the body that tend to become relatively bigger. And the question is saying it is best diagnosed with. Please remember the fact that the best way to diagnose acromegaly is not to test for growth hormone values alone, but we actually go in for a glucose tolerance test. We will be giving 100 grams of glucose to the patient. And in a normal person, glucose can suppress growth hormone production. But in this case, even if you give a loading dose of 100 grams of glucose, you will not be able to suppress the production of growth hormone. The best test for diagnosis of acromegaly is oral glucose tolerance test. The interpretation of the test is failure to suppress growth hormone production, because you see the tumor which is present here, the tumor which is causing excess production of growth hormone will be an autonomous tumor. It will do its own thing. It will keep on producing excess amount of growth hormone. You cannot control the tumor from physiological domain. The answer to this question is option number A. Option number B was anyway a dummy choice that can straightforward be ruled out. 24-hour urinary growth hormone levels. We never study a test like that. We study about 24-hour urinary catecholamines. We study about metanephrine. We talk about HIAA, but never about urinary growth hormone. GHRH stimulation test, well, that will help in testing for the hypothalamic pituitary axis. But here we want to demonstrate which hormone is primarily increased. That's going to be growth hormone. If the same question was asked as what is the best screening test for identification of acromegaly, in those circumstances, the screening test for identification of acromegaly would have been answered as plasma IGF-1 levels. But otherwise, if we rule out option number B, C, and D here, we can come to the conclusion the right answer to this question is option number A, and it is more of a fact-based question. Moving to the next one. Thyrotropin binding immunoassay is performed in the patient. All of the following will be shown in the patient below. So one, you need to remember TBII, that is thyrotropin binding immunoassay, is used to identify TSI antibody, that is thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. From the physical examination of this person, you can definitely notice the stare sign. You see, in you and me, the upper part of the 2 mm cornea is not visible. But look at this guy. I mean, in this particular person, you can not only see the upper part of the cornea, but you can also visualize the upper part of the sclera. I mean, the sclera part and the cornea part in the upper part is definitely visualized because of the retraction that is occurring in this case. This particular case is having sympathomimetic stimulation by excess of thyroid hormone, so the Muller's muscle is contracted, and therefore you would be having is an early manifestation of Graves' ophthalmopathy, that is lid lag. You're aware of the fact that proptosis is not the earliest manifestation of Graves from ophthalmopathy domain. It is rather a lid lag that develops, or lid retraction that develops in a person. So there are two ways you're knowing that this is Graves' disease. One is the image, and second is from the test which is given, TBII assay. The question is saying except. So let's look at A, alopecia. We study about alopecia with hypothyroidism. So this is what looks like the answer, but let us read the remaining options as well. So in this question, as compared to the previous one, you just can't straight away focus on the answer, or you just can't say this is an answer, because in the previous one, he was just asking you the test. And you know that the test for diagnosis of acromegaly is an oral glucose tolerance test. But in this one, you need to logically approach. You see thyroid storm. Well, why would you have a thyroid storm in a Graves' disease? Suppose you have planned a total thyroidectomy in a person of Graves' disease, or you have planned radioactive iodine ablation for a patient of Graves' disease. If you do not prepare the patient properly, what I mean by proper preparation is to start the person on anti-thyroid drugs, plus also start the patient on SSKI, that is saturated solution of potassium iodide. What will saturated solution of potassium iodide do? SSKI will shrink the gland. It will reduce the incidence of thyroid storm by causing a Wolff-Chaikoff effect. What is Wolff-Chaikoff effect? You downgrade the iodine trapping. If you downgrade the iodine trapping, the synthesis of hormone will decrease, and if the hormone itself is less, then the chances of thyroid storm will definitely be reduced. But if this is not followed, I repeat the statement once again. What I mean by inadequate preparation of the patient is that anti-thyroid drugs were prescribed by you, but the patient was not taking these drugs before surgery. You also prescribed SSKI, saturated solution of potassium iodide, for 10 consecutive days pre-operatively, but the person was not regular in taking them. So inadequate preparation of the patient and non-compliance of the part of the patient would mean that during surgery, disaster will strike, and thyroid storm can contribute to death of this patient on the table due to heart failure. Because thyroid hormones have a sympathomimetic drive. T3 is the active form of the gland, so they can be sinus tachycardia, they can be increase in sleeping pulse rate, and even in elderly patients, atrial fibrillation. Which means that these patients can die because of stroke, because the clots in the left atrial appendage will embolize to the brain. In patients of Graves' disease, when you have a Graves' ophthalmopathy, let me just highlight it. Let me say this is the eyeball, this is the cornea, and these are the muscles. So what's going to happen in this patient is that there would be development of deposition of glycosaminoglycans related to the eye muscles, and you know that glycosaminoglycans can trap water. In a nutshell, what I'm saying is that there is swelling related to these muscles, there is retrobulbar fat deposition. There are two things that I said. In Graves' ophthalmopathy, the eye muscles are swollen, and there's also retrobulbar fat deposition. So what it can cause is, it can press on the optic nerve. In this case, from the diagram I'm trying to show, the yellow structure which has been shown here is the optic nerve of these patients, and in Graves' ophthalmopathy there's a possibility of blindness. Yes, blindness. Diabetes patients will develop blindness, agree, due to retinal detachment and vitreous hemorrhage. But even in Graves' disease, the possibility of blindness is there due to two reasons. One is proptosis will contribute to corneal damage. There would be exposure keratitis. So corneal damage is seen. You see, you and me can blink, no? So our eyelid will wash the whole of the cornea. In this guy, because there is proptosis, there is inadequate blinking. Inadequate blinking will cause drying of the cornea, and drying of the cornea can contribute to definitely a blindness. The second reason for blindness is retrobulbar neuritis. So option number B, C, D are definitely found in a person who's suffering from Graves, but you do not get alopecia, which is the answer to our question, because mixed edema of the scalp explains the extensive alopecia that we see in hypothyroidism. The answer to this question is option number A. In the next question, he's talking about a person with hypertension and hypokalemia. The moment you read hypertension with hypokalemia, you know that you are talking about excess of aldosterone. You see, aldosterone will drive in salt and water and will kick out potassium. So hypokalemic alkalosis will occur. He's saying, what is the diagnosis? It cannot be a pheochromocytoma, because pheochromocytoma does have hypertension but no electrolyte imbalance. So I'm ruling it out. Conn syndrome looks like the answer even from the image, because you can distinctly see a tumor or relatively a mass. If you compare the two sides, you will definitely notice a mass which is relatively bigger in dimensions as compared to a normal adrenal gland. When it comes to Liddle syndrome does not have a tumor. It rather has overactivity of a channel. Epithelial sodium channel is the receptor for aldosterone. In Liddle syndrome, which is due to autosomal dominant reasons, there is a gain of function of epithelial sodium channel. So if the channel will work more, there would be more salt and water coming up at the body and potassium would be lost, but there would be no tumor present. Secondary hyperaldosteronism in turn is encountered with conditions like ascites, or for example PIH, or maybe Bartter syndrome, maybe Gentleman syndrome. Those are the conditions that cause secondary aldosteronism. Here the straightforward information is that because the person is suffering or having a tumor, this is causing overproduction of aldosterone, and that explains the clinical profile of the patient. The correct answer to this question is option number Bombay, that is Conn syndrome, primarily because hypertension and hypokalemic alkalosis is a standard feature seen with Conns. Moving to the next one. This is about a 25-year-old person with weakness and craving for salty foods with postural hypotension. The moment you read craving for salty foods, that means there is problem with aldosterone, because salt craving and postural hypotension are features of aldosterone deficiency. On examination, hyperpigmentation over the knuckles, very characteristic, no? Hyperpigmentation even on the tongue. You can even notice hyperpigmentation on the gingiva of this person. This tells you the fact that the hormone that is increased is ACTH, which also tells you that the problem is in the gland, because if ACTH is elevated, it means the pituitary is responding. The pituitary is responding, but the gland is not working. To highlight the aldosterone deficiency, sodium is on the lower side. Normal is 135 to 145, it is 130, and the potassium of this patient is elevated. I've already explained to you that sodium and potassium always have an inverse relation whenever aldosterone is coming in the picture. If aldosterone is less, sodium will be less, potassium will be elevated. The fasting blood sugar of 65 tells you that there is also a cortisol deficiency. So what we are talking about here is a person who's suffering from Addison disease of the primary variety. Why I'm saying primary variety? Because there is a hyperpigmentation. We do not see hyperpigmentation in secondary Addison or tertiary Addison. Option A says histoplasmosis. Well, histoplasmosis can cause damage to the gland. In immunocompromised individuals, it can destroy the adrenal gland. Amyloidosis is an infiltrative disorder that can destroy the adrenal gland. Between C and D, please appreciate Simon's disease basically means that there is a non-obstetric cause of damage to the pituitary. Obstetric cause of damage to the pituitary is going to be answered by you as Sheehan syndrome, but if it is going to be non-obstetric damage to the anterior pituitary, we call it Simon's disease. Why would it occur? It can occur due to arteriovenous malformation, it can occur because of hypertension, it can occur due to sickle cell anemia and sickling crisis. The bottom line is that we are going to call it secondary Addison disease because the problem is in the pituitary. In secondary Addison disease, ACTH will be less, and ACTH has a MSH-like activity. So in this case, rather the MSH activity will be less. So person will not be having hyperpigmentation, but will be having rather a pale skin. Autoimmune polyglandular syndrome, as the name suggests, is one of the leading causes of primary Addison disease. The logic behind this question is that option A, B, and D are examples of primary addition where the gland is busted. But when it comes to Simmons disease, the problem is the destruction or damage or busting of the pituitary. So we call it secondary addition disease, and that's why option number C is the correct answer to this question. You see, most of the questions that are asked in the exam can be ruled out by simple logic. Most of the questions are workable in 1 minute period. So don't spend too much of time in trying to do questions. Try to work them up under 1.5 minute. I understand first time you're doing it, they can go wrong, doesn't matter. But do try to read the observations, do try to read the explanation part, and at the same time, try to fast track your exclusion mode. The faster you, it's because this exam is not only about accuracy, it is also about speed. So combination of the two will do a great for your career. It will definitely upgrade your ranks and you will do excellent in your career. Thank you so much for hearing me out in this discussion.